be aware.
Okay. So this presentation, I'm going to say a little tiny bit about my background because it changes, I think, the outlook. I was fortunate to be born, the last child born to parents who came of age in the Depression, who saw transformative change, participated in transformative change, and were able to convey to me a sense of the sort of the miracle of it, the enormous distance that America traveled. Sort of, you know, its before and after states were really quite profoundly different, and different in ways that could not have been anticipated if you think about it. Just shortly before FDR was elected, Hoover was saying, oh, you know, we couldn't possibly provide relief to the unemployed because, you know, they don't have any character. And if they're able to feed their families and they're not working to earn that, that's just going to ruin them. And busily, his response to the Depression was funneling money to the wealthy, whose profit hoarding primarily caused the Depression. So you would not have had a lot of reason in lived experience to be optimistic at that time about America's potential for justice and an organization of our being in the world that aims at broad public benefit, at the common good. And yet we moved in that direction, given where we started from, by leaps and bounds in this very short period of time. So I would like us to keep that in mind as we go through the slides today, because the tendency, I think, my background is in politics, academic background is in politics and public policy. The tendency is always to kind of take your cues from recent experience. And the New Deal is so helpful because people did not do that. Instead, they let a crisis that presented them with a huge gap between anything like sort of an adequate social contract and what was actually occurring. The gap was so big, there was so little being done for the common good, and so much working against it, that became the sort of the measuring post for change, and really conversations among ordinary people and within councils of the unemployed. Without those, there wouldn't have been a New Deal. It was not about Washington suddenly having a magic moment and engaging in an overdue conversation on its own initiative. Sorry. On my computer, for some reason, this is PowerPoint is just does not really get along with Zoom well. I'm not sure why that is. Okay. I may have to switch things around. Well, there it is.
Okay, and Paul, while you're getting set up, I'll just let people know. So our intention was, we've got probably less than an hour of presentation and then plenty of time for conversation afterward. So with that being said, Paul, carry on.
So this is, especially for those of you who are going to have to leave, a preview. This is where we end up, where I end up, is with this set of steps, all of which respond to urgent realities in 2021 that we'll be looking at, all of which have immediate benefits as well as the emissions reduction stuff needed to kind of shift us in the direction of a livable future. I'm sorry Keith Boos was not able to make it. This began with, I was a late joiner of something that calls itself the Climate Crisis Policy Initiative, it's very exciting just as a phenomenon that a network of activists sort of discovered their legislative capacity and took it upon themselves to put together a package of climate bills for the next Congress, anticipating a change in leadership. Correctly, it turns out. Most of that experience, unfortunately, most of what I had to report was disappointing, with the big exception of the Fracking Ban Act. Most of the bills didn't do much, really lacked mechanisms of action to deliver on their goals, and lacked goals proportionate to where we are in the climate crisis. So this little early section is mostly about sort of cognitive shifts that come from things we're all very familiar with, but just looking at them a little differently. So if you're a climate activist, a climate researcher, if you're giving regular attention to this crisis, some variation of this graph is just ubiquitous. You can't get away from it. It's everywhere. And it's really a graph of two divergent futures. One that, the sort of the default trajectory, the trajectory that amazingly enough we find ourselves on, that is racing to a future of 3.2 to 7C of warming, and one that involves, as you can see, quite a departure in terms of how we are conducting ourselves in the world, but that arguably still in 2021 could get us below 2C of warming. A great deal of effort goes into encouraging us to see this sort of upside down reality directly on its head, where the current trajectory is seen as the path of least resistance, and escaping it for something better is just requiring heroic effort and overcoming enormous obstacles, and just so much work, so hard. And I think it's very hard not to internalize that. to some extent. And it can affect how climate advocates convey their message to the public, and the degree of hope they convey, the degree of conviction they convey about the desirability of the steps that lead to that more livable future, the near-term benefits, et cetera. So this is just a little corrective that I find really helpful. I mean, I need it. I use it on myself, this sort of reminder that what we're doing is actually the path of maximum resistance, that every step on this path imposes ruinous costs, that those costs are growing exponentially, and that the inverse is kind of true of the steps that lead us in the direction of a sustainable future. So when I say reality-based climate policy or climate solutions, I know there are people who would quibble that reality is much bleaker than anything I'm going to talk about. What I have found is that we don't need the sort of the most dire reports. If the goal is to get to transformative change, if the goal is to be able to show people that we're communicating to that it's just essential, just necessary to make much greater than incremental change and to do it immediately, this is enough. This version of reality, which is from the 2019 emissions gap report, I call it the 7.6% solution. And it sounds far less radical than it is. The way that this becomes clearly, overwhelmingly, a prescription for transformative change is going from, this is of course a 7% reduction globally for humanity collectively, as soon as you look at where the emissions are coming from, and particularly the per capita emissions, because the higher your per capita emissions are, the less it costs you in terms of standards of living, in terms of sort of wrenching adjustments to reduce them. As soon as you look at where the emissions are that we need to cut, that 7.6% figure grows dramatically. This is a really helpful context. I spend a fair amount of time talking with people outside the developed world, people in Africa primarily, but also some folks in Central America and Asia, where they're experiencing the catastrophic climate change that we talk about in the future tense now. Life is becoming impossible. And so they are really keenly aware that they did not create this crisis. And if you do the math, it turns out that sort of Anglo-European countries, who are less than 15% of the world's population, are the source of almost 60% of its cumulative CO2 emissions. That really shapes how the rest of the world, regards how they define sort of the minimum of international cooperation and what their expectations are of us. So this was my first run at translating that 7.6% annual cut into what we would need to do here. If we were cutting 11.4% year, it would not be close to enough. Again, using this kind of optimistic analysis, it leaves us way short. This, I think, is about right. And you know, when I say about right, I can tell you very simply what I mean by that. There are things where, you know, you might be willing to attempt solutions that you suspect aren't adequate. After all, we did that New Deal. We did a fair amount of experimenting. This is not, of course, that kind of situation. Here, the presumption really has to be that we aim for what we are confident is an adequate level of ambition, an adequate pace and scale of emissions reduction, and the underlying change needed to accomplish it. So you can see for the United States and for Russia, which have the highest per capita emissions, the path is quite steep. Achievable, but not confusable with small, politically unchallenging increments of change. The climate crisis is so full of deep, profound lessons, so full of corrections for a kind of large errors in perception by the dominant cultures. One of them is zero-sum thinking. That's really does not survive a sustained encounter with the climate crisis. And if you go back to this graph, so we need, at the top of the graph, we need very large reductions. But in order for them to get us where we want to go, to a future of as far below 2C of warming as possible, we also need this part of the world not to dramatically increase its emissions. And since there are, some real deficits in many of these places in terms of, reasonable standards of living, just sort of secure access to basic life requirements. They need to be able to expand access to electricity. This is particularly true, I am particularly aware of it in Africa. I think it's 31 of Africa's 54 countries. More than half the population does not have access to electricity, and that means, you can't really have hospitals, you can't really, schools can't function in the same way. There's a lot. Water pumps are not an option. So the point of this really is, because it doesn't feature it in my set of solutions, is just to remind us that a big part of it is that we have a compelling interest in helping Africa and the rest of the global South find ways to improve life for their populations without fossil fuels. There are people the people I talk to in Africa have a lot to teach us. They're very aware of the fossil fuel development model being out of question, and enthusiastic, hopeful about leapfrogging it and kind of leading us into the future. Can you skip through some of this. This is the basic argument for the Fracking Ban Act. We learned in 2019 what we really already knew. Anyone who had been paying close attention to fracking knew it was flooding the atmosphere with a massive amount of methane. But the studies that were done to sort of do methane accounting weren't really adequately reflecting it. In 2019, that changed. And the specific chemical signature of fracked natural gas is different than conventional natural gas. And when we corrected for that, what we found was that it was the American fracking boom was the largest driver of this just alarming spike in global emissions of methane, which had been, they rose in the 80s when the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union eventually, was developing its natural gas resources. And then they had leveled off in much of the 2000s. And right around the time that the fracking boom gets going in earnest, they just spike. That is needs addressing urgently, just as a crisis, but it's also a wonderful opportunity. The good news about discovering, as we have through many, many studies, that the fossil fuel share of methane, and specifically the fracking boom share of methane, much larger than even critics of fracking had guessed. The good news is that means we can change it. You know, when we discover that we're the cause of a problem, that is always written into the bad news is the good news. That as the agents of it, we can change what we're doing and reduce or eliminate it, or hopefully reverse it to some extent. And that is the wonderful thing about methane, is that its career in the atmosphere, though it is extremely violent with that heat trapping capacity, is also brief. So if we stop emitting a volume of it as massive as the fracking boom is producing as I speak, the actual atmospheric level of methane will begin to drop almost immediately. And that actually slows global warming. It's not just a necessary condition for that. Just spend one more second here. I've been researching the climate crisis in a fairly intensive way. I mean, as the primary use of my waking hours for some years now. And I spent a lot of time on the fracking because we do not, like the EPA, when it makes its estimate of our greenhouse gas emissions, it uses this ridiculously low estimate of the methane emissions from fossil fuel operations in America. No one believes that estimate. So, but because we're used to seeing a certain set of numbers, when you see what the eliminating fracking would actually do over not that long a period of time, this is over 15 years cumulatively, excuse me, is jarring. Oh no, that can't be right. But I'm pretty sure it is right. Bob Howarth and I and some other folks who are more conservative, I went over these numbers 6 ways to Sunday. What no one disagrees about, even if they would cut the numbers here in half, no one disagrees that the spike in methane is a potential, it is potentially fatal to the goals of the Paris Accord, to hopes for a future below 2C, and that it's the fossil fuel portion that is easiest and quickest to deal with, where we need to focus our energy. The fossil fuel industry has had just wonderful success in America at obstructing progress towards responding to the climate crisis with a single argument. The argument is that fossil fuels provide jobs and energy independence, and we just can't imperil either of those things. So it is politically as well as practically just a necessity. You cannot get rid of fracking if you aren't simultaneously scaling up renewable energy. And because America trails the developed world in its growth of renewable energy, we really need to do that sort of at the fastest pace humanly possible. But this is such a familiar policy focus, I'm not going to spend much time talking about it. This, however, is not so familiar, and everyone should know it. Right after the 2018 election, you know, AOC had that stunning upset victory, and she had campaigned, really focused her campaign, New Deal. So Yale and George Mason University, which have quite different agendas, polled voters across the political spectrum to ask if they would support, and you can see spelled out at the bottom of the screen, maybe too small to read, they spelled out exactly what they meant. You know, investing a massive amount of federal tax dollars to transition to clean renewable energy. Would you support that? The lowest majority was 57% of conservative Republicans. Every time I share that in a gathering of climate activists or an online forum, people are shocked. So given the very real challenges we face, what we don't want is to have challenges that aren't real, inhibiting our sense of what's possible, downgrading our ambition. This is much more relevant to what's possible than sort of the recent legislative habits of Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi. Those are changeable. This is a wealth of possibility that it's very exciting, the opportunities to harvest it, what we can offer, especially to the red states. You know, there has been so little public investment. We're just starved for it. And there's all sorts of ways in which this will bring immediate improvements in life. Probably the least discussed, given its importance, aspect of the climate crisis among the American climate activists I speak with is protecting and restoring vital ecosystems like the Earth's equatorial rainforests. There are reasons that this doesn't have the central place in our agendas that it should, but it's essential to know that this is really job one. In the Amazon, there is a tipping point, a point at which the Amazon rainforest can no longer produce enough rain through transpiration to sustain itself as a rainforest. At that point, it dies back to dry savanna. The incredible biodiversity, the incredible number and variety of species that require it to be a rainforest, of course, be out of luck, but the consequence of that happening is
Okay, I think Paul froze, but we seem to be back on.
I think he's unfrozen but muted.
Huh. He is not muted.
how are we doing now?
Now I
Oh,
hear you.
there you are. Thanks, Brett. Yeah, I think we lost you for a second there, Paul.
Yeah, sorry about that.
All right.
See if I can get this going again and then do the share right. Get it on the right screen. I apologize.
Okay. Glitches happen.
Okay, so the share should be filled now with that graph, and I'll get us back to where we were.
I think you had us on full screen before, which was easier for us to see.
Yes, I'm sorry. I still don't have the share right. Once more with stealing. See if we can't get it. There it is.
Thanks.
Okay, so that appalling figure at the top there of 500 billion tons of carbon dioxide sequestered in the Amazon, right? That's, it's been sequestering carbon for a very long time, many, many millennia. And the thing is that a large portion of that carbon will be released back into the atmosphere in just a terrifyingly brief period of time if we allow deforestation to continue. Carlos Nobra and Thomas Lovejoy, who know it best, told us at the end of 2019, it's at its tipping point now. It cannot withstand continued deforestation. And needs now, they say, we need not just to stop deforestation, but to reverse it and restore the Amazon rainforest, get rid of the roads, carving it up, to fragment the forest to make it much less resilient, and let the indigenous people whose knowledge of this incredibly complex, gorgeous ecosystem has been built up over, well, we know for sure 10,000 years of shaping as well as being shaped and educated by their rainforest home. We need to empower them to act. Congo rainforest is in a little less of a dire state, but it's not expected to last the century. It too is losing its ability to absorb CO2. And a little secret about the Congo is that it has these massive peat reserves, which in and of themselves, 30.6 gigatons of carbon multiplied by the multiplier to go from carbon to CO2, that is just a fatal amount of CO2. We cannot let that happen. So this is, what I like to call among friends, among fellow activists, a no-brainer. You don't really need to spend a lot of time looking at this to figure out that I can't wait. Happily, there is a proposal that has traction, that has legs. It has legs with governments all over the world have signaled their support for this. There are big players in international finance who have signaled some support for this. And this is the effort. This is not the end goal, but by 2030 to have protected 30% of the Earth's land and oceans. That is an enormous reversal of, it's an enormous reversal of direction. The thing that we see a lot that if you're not careful can lead you to despair is that there's a kind of unthinking behavior that is just continuing to assault these ecosystems despite really a lot of public information. It's now pretty well known that we all depend on them, living and thriving. But there's a big gap between behavior and action. And when we act, when we make decisions as a collective, we typically do exhibit a great deal more intelligence than we do when we're acting as private individuals, tampering with things far too big for us. This proposal is helped along and kind of rests on top of a fairly groundbreaking report that is a collaboration of many disciplines, but especially a collaboration between science and ecology and economics. Because we still have a kind of dominant class of policymakers who think very much in conventional economic terms. So they've done a very good job of translating the kind of self-evident benefits of preserving and restoring this large portion of the earth and the economic near-term benefits that they've been able to show are really compelling. So that 5-to-1 figure, that's not like ultimately, because we managed not to denude the planet of life, that's in the near term. That there are things that we can easily demonstrate. An example for America is that all of the agriculture in the southern United States would be devastated by Amazon dieback. The rain that the Amazon generates is very significant for agriculture in the United States. Campaign for Nature website, I really encourage you to check it out. It has a lot of hidden goodies. They do a pretty good job of tracking all of the relevant studies, relevant initiatives in and out of government. So, there's a lot more action on this than we might be aware of. There's a scientist, he's another Nobra. There are two great scientists who studied the Amazon rainforest, whose last name is Nobra. One of them is Antonio Nobra. Antonio is famous now for teaching the world how the Amazon addresses not just the cause of global heating, but the symptoms, providing rainfall and cooling temperatures for this vast area outside it. and really acting at a global level. But he is also famous now for saying, he says, Greta Thunberg says that we need to listen to the science. I say that scientists need to listen to the wise people of the forest. The practical, immediate practical implications of protecting and restoring the Amazon and the Congo rainforest both are that we would need to engage indigenous people. This study by Victoria Reyes is one of a number showing that ecosystem restoration efforts are far more successful when indigenous people play a leading role. And that little statistic at the top, that the estimate that 80% of the surviving biodiversity on land is found on indigenous land. Think about what we all know about sort of being in an age of mass extinction. What it's like is there is this sort of onrushing tide of extinction. And then there are these islands where biodiversity is being nourished and sustained. And they are pretty much, almost uniformly, those islands where indigenous people have some level of land right and stewardship. The Campaign for Nature has baked into it an 80% increase in the land held by indigenous people and in stewardship by indigenous people. I have talked about this proposal some with Hindu Ibrahim, who's an indigenous leader from Africa, from Chad, and a great champion of the importance of traditional or indigenous ecological knowledge in addressing the climate crisis. And she really shares my enthusiasm for the opportunity that this proposal presents, but also would like us to know that it can't be incidental, the role of indigenous leadership. We need to elevate the wisdom that is succeeding at sustaining the abundance and variety of life on Earth, and allow it to inform all that we do, not just this one proposal. I've talked longer than I intended to. I'll just say a little tiny bit about how I see these kind of climate imperatives or climate essentials playing out. When I did my work with the Climate Crisis Policy Initiative, they had 10 bills that they wanted me to analyze. I did. One of them did exactly what it said and produced this outsized effect, the Fracking Ban Act. But the rest of the bills, almost uniformly, they just were not written to achieve much. They did not have mechanisms of action to deliver on their stated goals. And their stated goals often were completely out of proportion. Now, an example of that, Ethiopia is a country in Africa with a GDP of $8 billion a year. Ethiopia is menaced, as really all Africa now is, by desertification. And so Ethiopia is very serious about tree planting, about reforestation, and succeeded last year, even generated some headlines, planting 350 million trees a day. Reforestation is the larger part of the Climate Stewardship Act, and its sort of potential impact on emissions. It has 5 separate reforestation provisions, each with its own timeline. Even if the timelines were mandates, and they aren't, even if the phrase "to the extent practical" did not occur 18 times in about 3 pages in this reforestation section, even if none of that were true and we took the number of trees and the timelines provided as gospel, it would take the Climate Stewardship Act with all 5 provisions combined 2 years, over 2 years actually, to plant the number of trees that Ethiopia managed in 1 day. This is not meant to be depressing at all. It is exactly what, from a political science standpoint, I would expect from a Congress that has been shaped, yes, by the fossil fuel industry and other forms of corporate lobbying that are incredibly aggressive and loud and unrelenting, always know exactly what they want, but shaped also by 40 years, really. If you look at the history that preceded Reagan, 40 years of almost shocking civic disengagement. And so this is not about how Congress will never do anything that's responsive to the climate crisis. It's just about the need for us to change the environment in which Congress operates and provide it with an agenda that has appropriate ambition. Saying to Congress over and over, please listen to the science. The young climate activists who I spend a lot of time on social media talking with all really know that's not working. So this talk is in part where I would like to get a few months from now is to have something we can take to climate advocacy groups all over the country and say, look, go to your elected representatives at all levels of government with this. This is what we need. So that's, I think, pretty much where I intended to go. The item I didn't get to that is real important, doing even 2 of the things I mentioned. If we only banned fracking and started scaling up renewable energy, that would be such a dramatic change in direction of energy policy in the United States. It would radically alter the environment in which international cooperation does or does not occur. There is just a terrible deficit of trust right now in the international community. And the problem is that the Paris Accord, in a way, was wired to fail. It has this reliance on voluntary reductions in emissions by national governments made at their discretion, which means that if you're in the government in China, or if you're in Congress, if you're in any government that is a major emitter, and you're advocating for big dramatic action appropriate given the requirements of any livable future, the instant rebuke is, well, no one else is going to do that. And why should we make this huge expense and divert all of this energy away from what we're doing to refashioning ourselves into a climate-friendly country when it will be irrelevant unless everyone else who is a major emitter signs on. So the great benefit of significant, can't miss it, as a definite change in direction, climate legislation, and really a big part of why that has to happen this year is that it immediately makes it much, much, much more possible to negotiate a binding agreement among the top emitters, which is in all of their interests, where they agree that they will all make deep, rapid cuts by making big public investments simultaneously, and no one incurs a comparative disadvantage. So that's, I think, the direction we want to be going in. I also didn't actually get to talk about universal basic income and securing basic life requirements, which is also a necessary part of what the UN calls green recovery. You know, everyone who has anything to do with the climate crisis in the international community, they're all saying green recovery, green recovery, green recovery. We need to simultaneously, in America, we need to shift away from fossil fuels, but we also, to make that an ecologically viable enterprise, we need to eliminate a great deal of wasteful and destructive economic activity. And the only way to do that, the only way to make a transition this big is universal basic income. We have to give people a secure space in which to sort of pioneer the future, because it involves changing so many things at once. And we need people to have time and attention and energy free to do that. And we need to feel as a country really secure in it, that we are all in it together in a way we never will when we allow such a large portion of our people, especially our families with children, to suffer, you know, right now as I speak, depression era levels of hunger and housing insecurity. So that's a big part of it too. And now I will stop talking.
Okay, so I want to first open it up if people have direct questions for Paul, and just the plan for our remaining hour. In fact, as we move into direct questions, I'm going to make this invitation. Feel free to stand up and stretch for a minute. You know, we are living humans, even if we are on Zoom. So it's good to move your body around a little bit if that feels right to you. But then we'll just spend maybe 5 to 10 minutes, take a few direct questions for Paul. Then we're going to do 20 minutes in small breakout rooms. And then we'll come back and see what we've arrived at from there. So again, first, any direct questions? I'll switch to gallery view here, and you can wave at me. You can electronically put your hand up, or you can actually physically put your hand up and let me know that you want to talk. Kathleen, go ahead, and then Carol.
I'm wondering if there are any campaigns that you can recommend that we could do something about in terms of the equatorial rainforest.
So there are two types of proposals for addressing it. One type would be better than nothing, but it's totally inadequate. And those are trade agreements that would more energetically restrict the importation of beef sourced in land cleared in the Amazon rainforest, for example. 80% of the deforestation in the Amazon is the beef industry. A lot of that beef comes here. But the only real solution, especially because we have so many ecosystems that are in the process, and it's not just rainforests, it's also the oceans, in the process of going from carbon sinks to carbon sources. In the case of the rainforest, in the case of the Amazon, really from carbon sink to carbon bomb. And so the only real solution is just to acknowledge that we have got to reverse course and protect these ecosystems. That Campaign for Nature proposal, I really encourage you to look at it. Because if you have friends who are not necessarily climate aware and tend to find your idea of climate solutions impractical, that report of theirs really packs a punch with a bunch of near-term economic benefits. It's just a tremendous investment. You could not make a better investment, even in the near term.
Someone I'm at the end of the road, somebody drove up and started honking and I had to run out. So I missed part of what you said, but.
The gist of it was the Campaign for Nature is the real deal.
Okay.
And there are more ambitious versions of it. The Global Deal for Nature talks about 50% as quickly as we can get there. Everybody agrees who's looking at this aspect of the climate crisis that we have all the information we need, like to know with a certainty, we can't fail to benefit, no matter how you define benefit, from protecting, ceasing commercial exploitation of as much of the earth as rapidly as possible, and doing the all-important work of restoring and adapting ecosystems that require that as well as protection if they're going to survive.
In terms of what you said about indigenous control, I'd just like to mention Survival International, which is a group that works internationally to defend the rights of indigenous people to live on their land in the way that they do. They're the only international group that I'm aware of that does this internationally, and you can support them as I do. Survival International.
I just wanted to mention that there's cultural survival, which is a really good worldwide group in terms of protecting indigenous rights, particularly in the tropics. And for the headwaters area of the Amazon Pachamama Alliance is really actively involved in protecting what they call the Sacred Headwaters Project. So Carol had a question. Carol, your hand is up, but you're muted. Can you unmute?
So sorry. When you said that once we do this, we'll get international cooperation, was it the implementation of the Green New Deal along with the conserving 30% of land and ocean that the U.S. is in charge of or has authority over? Is that what you were saying would get us the international cooperation? Or did I miss what you were saying?
It's really the domestic initiatives, right? That's what's not happening. I mean, China's made some good overtures. They had a very unambitious pace for their energy transition. They upped the ambition a lot. And I love this. Despite China being China, their scientists told their leaders publicly, no, that's not enough. So there's an opening for sure. This is not wishful thinking. There really is an opportunity for serious international cooperation, but somebody has to take the domestic initiatives, signaling unmistakably a change in direction toward a sustainable future. And then I think we'll be amazed how rapid international progress can be, because it's been a lot of inertia.
So that's the reverse of the usual argument, which is, why should we do it ourselves? Nobody else will do it. Your argument is, if we do it, that will do it. That will help the rest of the world do it. So thank you for that. I was struck when I first got the link to the Campaign for Nature that this is something that most of our national ecological organizations or environmental organizations probably know about, but are not promoting to the extent that they need to. That the Green New Deal is being promoted by politicians, and but this 30 by 30 is not, this just doesn't have the promotion behind it. And I was proposing just to our local people here, us, and whatever other local organizations there are, to go to the national organizations and tell them they need to promote this, and they need to promote it to their locals as well. So I'm wondering, when you're saying that in a few months you'll have what's needed to be proposed, do you have any idea of how we can implement, how we can promote this? I get like 30 or 40 appeals for money every day in my email from various very worthy causes. But this is the one I'd contribute everything to, besides my support for Nova Sutras, everything I can too, if I could find the right lever to move this, to move the world.
Well, there's a ton we can do. I see in our group here several people who I know to be climate educators, very active in helping other people understand the situation we're in. We need to make this the focus, really, as a corrective, the focus of climate advocacy, because it has been neglected so long, and it's just crazy, and it's kind of pervasive. If you look at a lot of the groups who on their websites will show you, here's the emissions from the CO2 emissions from 2018 or 2019. Try to find one that includes emissions from deforestation. You can't. Even though Forest Watch estimates just in the last few decades, 105 gigatons of CO2 from deforestation. And even those studies by scientists are constantly multiplying that figure. The formula for calculating the emissions from tropical deforestation has been improved. It now, the result is a 600% increase in our estimate of those emissions. But we all know, we know more than enough, I should say. It's largely a matter of making it visible. There is, by the way, a domestic version of the 30 by 30 proposal that would protect 30% of the US. It is an excellent alternative to phony baloney, like the Climate Stewardship Act. I mean, that could be improved, but as it's written, it is a great big nothing. And we could, this is desirous. It hits our erogenous zone because we would like to save nature. And what this does is just save nature, kind of by fiat. So that's appealing.
Could I just, one more. these organizations that helped the Democrats win this last election were appealing for money all the time. And I gave what I could. And it takes money. It takes a large promotional effort to get things done on the political scale. That's been made clear to me just by my experience of these organizations that pushed, for instance, Ralph Warnock and John Ossoff over the top in the Georgia runoff. That was, they're always saying it's a matter of money, that we need to get these advertisements out to make it clear that unless politicians do what we say, what we're asking, that they're going to get a lot of blowback from the voters. So all of this advertising and promotion is what's needed to get things done. So I'm just wondering how nationally it could be coordinated to get this political objective accomplished. If you have any idea of how that can be done.
I have too many ideas, given how much of your time I've taken up talking, but one of them, we should not let any climate bill gain our approval if it does not have built into it that climate scientists who are not politically appointed will guide its implementation and modify it as needed. That would have been a saving provision for the Climate Stewardship Act, because any climate scientist looking at it would have gone berserk because it's a cruel hoax. But we don't have that. Nancy talked to me about something like that happening at the executive branch level, but we need that in Congress.
Yeah.
We need to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. We will not be happy until we hear people we trust, because they have the knowledge and because they are not politically appointed, saying, yes, there's a legislative agenda in place that does the bare minimum, at least, that makes sense. And if we convey that nothing less than that will do, we are doing the whole world a great service. So let's do that.
All right, so Brett had a question, and then Christine, and if we can keep these fairly brief, and then we'll go into breakout rooms so that everybody gets a chance to have some time to talk.
Yeah, this isn't so much a question. I just want people to be aware that the Romero Institute is working on something that's very much like what Paul was talking about in terms of trying to create legislation. It's largely focused at the state level right now, but with a goal that it will also be at the federal level. And there's an outline of their Green New Deal for California proposal on the Santa Cruz Climate Action Network website. I can put a link in the chat. And they're also doing calls every Wednesday evening for anyone that wants to get involved in helping to shape that legislation. And I mean, there's a lot more to it than I'm saying, but I don't want to talk too long. But I'll put the link to the outline and my email address in the chat if anyone wants more details. And it's every Wednesday night. There's a call, and I can forward the invitation to anyone that's interested. So I'm keeping it short, so I'll stop.
Oh, thanks for all that, Brett. Chris, go ahead, Chris.
Well, thank you, Paul, for doing all the work and presenting these things to all of us. And I learned some things. And I have a very minor question, but it's one that goes through my mind, and maybe you or someone else in the group knows. There's discussion about reforestation. And so you gave that marvelous comparison of the Climate Stewardship Act and what was actually being done. And I think you said Ethiopia, is that correct? And my question is, for all the trees that get planted, how many survive? How do you keep the trees that get planted alive? What's the net outcome? Because I look at, like what's happening in California and it's very hard to wrap my mind around. Things are burning, drying out. If we replant things, do they live? How does it work?
Right. About half of all tree planting that says it's for the climate is monoculture plantations. They are not helpful. They absorb a fraction of the carbon that you would get from planting real forests. They do not host biodiversity. They can't anchor biodiversity. So that's bad. And then there are really well-intended efforts, like across Africa, that are just not adequately funded. So, you have to have a certain amount of time free. There has to be resources at some minimal level in order to do exactly what you're talking about, caring for the ecosystems as we restore them. I think we should use the phrase ecosystem restoration often when we say plant trees or reforestation, because that's what we're talking about.
Right, because it reminded me of that article in The Guardian about the weather makers, that group in, I believe, the Netherlands, who was really partnering, using a lot of the ideas they got from John Liu about how you stage renewal, and that you have to do all this preparatory work before an area can actually get to a point where it can support reforestation. But anyway, that's enough. That was my question. And then also, there's a lot of talk about renewable energy, and I don't hear a lot of talk about like population, like how we curb population. Although I recently read an article that said there's so many chemicals in the human global body that we are heading toward extinction ourselves. Our fertility rates are plummeting. And I'm wondering if anyone was aware of that article and if it's based in fact.
That is happening. Some places you can see it from pollution. I don't think we can know that it's happening globally.
Well, I'll try to find the article and I'll send it to the Nova Sutras, and then you guys can like read it and see the scientist that was talking about it. And I haven't heard anybody talking about it, so I didn't know if it was relevant. So I'll find that.
The population focus is usually wrong. Where is the world's population growing fastest? Africa. Right. What continent contributes the least to the climate crisis? Africa.
Right.
Also, it is not a mystery what we need to do to help young women in Africa, sort of do family planning. We know that Africa needs funds to build a ton of schools. We know that we can provide, in the measure that we have robbed the developing world, we can, do a little reversal of that. We can get back and fund development for young women is a particular emphasis. I know the drawdown people emphasize it, but my personal connection with Africa makes that so compelling. The families who can't farm come apart, and there's child brides. That's exploding. Child prostitution is exploding. These things that are like the worst possible way of coping with climate change are happening because we won't invest, not because we don't know, just because we won't invest the funds needed. There is like this great labor pool for ecosystem restoration. All the people who are subsistence farmers, that's 60% of Africa, gets their living directly from the land, has very little involvement in the cash economy. It's all rainfall dependent. So when you have these giant droughts, which the World Food Program blames completely in Southern Africa on climate change, that's no longer viable for them, but they have all the right skill sets they have a closeness to the land and understanding of life that is perfect for doing large-scale restoration. And large-scale ecosystem restoration could save a huge number of lives in Africa. At least if people like John Liu are right. It's both a climate game changer and a humanitarian imperative to fund that.
Thank you.
Thanks. So again, in order to let everyone talk a little bit deeper about this, I'm going to put us into small rooms. You'll have about 15 minutes with 2 or 3 other people. So do make sure that voices that haven't been heard from yet get a chance to talk there and share ideas. And the focus of your conversation, to the extent that you want it to be, could be about, so what do we do together and locally to help get these especially these 3 really critical things: the fracking ban, the Green New Deal, and 30 by 30, help get more momentum under them. So that's what I'm suggesting. But again, feel free to let the conversation take the direction that feels most important to you. And we'll be back in about 15 minutes.